Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we're broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. with a live audience. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I have a few tips to share with you. We will accept questions at the very end of the program. For those of you here in the room with us, we just ask that you use the I/O microphones so that we can capture your voice online. For those of you who are watching on this YouTube webpage, we will accept your questions as well. Please use the chat feature. Also, we have several handouts. Hopefully you picked them up on your way in. For those of you, again, watching online, you can find those handouts on our webpage. You'll see several hyperlinks, so you'll see presentation slides, handout, and a hyperlink to the captioning. So, for today's presentation, we will have a discussion by Martha Murphy and Joseph Scanlon on how we respond to requests under the Freedom of Information Act, commonly referred to as FOIA. Mr. Scanlon has been the FOIA and Privacy Act Officer of the National Archives since November 2010. He also serves as our alternate liaison to the Interagency Security Classification Appeal Panel. Mr. Scanlon has an MA in Public Administration from the American Public University and a BA in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland. Ms. Murphy began working at the National Archives in 1991 after receiving her BA in History from Loyola College in Baltimore and MA in U.S. History from Loyola University in Chicago. She joined the Special Access and FOIA branch in 1995 and currently oversees the work of its 20 members and provides access policy for research services. And now for our presentation on Freedom of Information Act requests at the National Archives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenters, Martha Murphy and Joseph Scanlon.
Thank you.
Hope you all don't mind. I'm going to take a quick picture because we're going to be tweeting about this when I get back. So say cheese. All right.
Oh, yeah. All right, so the presentation that we're giving is obviously it's all about NARA and what we do and how we interact with the Freedom of Information Act. But the key thing about it is that NARA has always had a mission of openness and transparency and a desire to get the records that are brought into our agency out to the American public. And we vastly predate the FOIA, which was not enacted into law until '66 and actually had teeth later on. But NARA has been around since 1936, making sure that the records that come in are available to the American public. One of the things that we're going to talk about is, having said that, we do accession records into our holdings that are sensitive. And also there are a level of the records that we, in the processing of those records and how we do our job as an agency, are also subject to the FOIA. That's predominantly what I handle. And in that situation, those records are also subject to the FOIA. And but having said all that, still the majority of our records are very much open to the public. You can come into this building and everything is open. You do not need to submit a FOIA request for Civil War records. It's just not necessary. So, our access policy. The National Archives has, what's intriguing about the FOIA is that we're the only agency that actually interacts with the FOIA in a number of layers and ways that no other federal agency handles. We have, as I was explaining, we have the operational records and how we actually do the job do our jobs here at the National Archives. Those records are subject to the FOIA. That's what my office and the Office of the General Counsel, that's where I interact with the FOIA. When records are accessioned or when they're transferred legally into NARA's custody, whether it be executive branch records, well actually it's executive branch records, say the FBI, Department of Justice, EPA, CIA, any of those records, the ones that are still sensitive, those are also subject to the FOIA. Martha's unit actually handles all of those things. We also have presidential records that at the end of the administration, those records after 5 years are also subject to the FOIA. There's a couple of other little unique aspects with regards to presidential records, but we'll get to that later. And then our agency also accepts records from the legislative and the courts. Those are not subject to FOIA. Martha will be talking about that a little bit in more detail. But again, the National Archives tries to make those records very much accessible to the American public without the need of the Freedom of Information Act.
So we thought we'd just give you a brief history of how we handled access here at the National Archives, just to sort of set the stage for how we do things now, understand where we've been and where we're going. So prior to the passing of the Freedom of Information Act, agencies would transfer records to the National Archives with access agreements. So they would say, we're going to send these to you, but they shouldn't be made available for 20 years or 30 years. And every agency had their own access agreements. So that's how we worked in the past. Prior to the passing of the Presidential Records Act during Jimmy Carter's administration, presidents owned their records when they left. They were not owned by the people, as executive branch agencies are by the citizens of the United States. But they, from Hoover on, they deeded them back to the National Archives, and they were deposited in presidential libraries. And again, there were access agreements that came along with those deeds. So that's how things were done in the past. Once the FOIA was passed, so I pass it along here, none of those agreements were legal any longer. Particularly the deeded agreements still were, but for the executive branch agencies, they were sort of overtaken by the FOIA. And so we went back, we looked at all the agreements, and we said to ourselves, well, if the agreement was concerned about privacy, we could still withhold for privacy, but then that would be our discretion to determine at what point in time the privacy interests will fade away. So in order to still be able to consider records closed at the time that they are transferred in, NARA created general restrictions. It's in our Code of Federal Regulations. And if you look at the general restrictions, which it's a little small here to see, but on the left-hand side are the 9 categories within the Freedom of Information Act where agencies are allowed to, these are the justifications why records can be withheld in part or in full. On the right is our Code of Federal Regulations. Our general restrictions simply mirror the FOIA. So the first provision of the FOIA deals with national security information. Our first general restriction is national security information, and they're on all through the nine provisions. So for presidential records, since the records that are actually presidential will not be deeded any longer, their access is controlled by the Presidential Records Act. And as Joe said, after a period of time, they are subject to FOIA. Similarly, during that 5-year period, the staff of the presidential records are going through those files and determining what can be made available as soon as possible and what records contain sensitivities and will require some review prior to release. So when records are transferred to the National Archives and we take legal custody, we use these general restrictions to analyze the records as they come in the door. Sometimes agencies will let us know there is of course, a legal document that they have to use to transfer custody from themselves to us, and this is called a transfer record, and in that transfer record they can state that these records should be restricted and then give us the FOIA provision under which the restriction would follow. Much of the records are immediately made available to the public. Things that are older, for instance, more than 30 years old, have fewer sensitivities than the newer records, or things that may have been published, any public affairs records, or routine policy type files where nothing would fit into the 9 categories of the FOIA. We're going to consider them open when they come in the door. If we determine that they cannot be screened, and they cannot be made available immediately, we will document that, and then they will need to be requested under a Freedom of Information Act or some sort of screening before they can be released. So when they come in, our staff flag the records. We do this using our holdings management system. This is our most basic level of control for the records. And it documents where every box is on the shelf and what these series are. But we also have metadata that can help to inform us if there is an access restriction. This is helpful because the next step along the process for these records will be for them to be further described, reboxed, and at that time, those descriptions will go into the National Archives catalog. So that if you are a researcher, for instance, someone in California hoping to come to the National Archives, our hope is that the access restrictions will be clear in the catalog so you don't make a trip if there are records that are actually restricted. The one thing to keep in mind with all access restriction, that is, as time passes, records become less sensitive. And that's a real gift for us here at the National Archives because the records that we accession, we keep forever. So everything will eventually be released. And as that happens, we will be updating the metadata so that agencies, or so that researchers know when records are becoming available. You want to do the next one?
Yeah. So the biggest question is, I'm a researcher and I want to know what's open at NARA. Well, that's nice. It's not quite that simple, only because the National Archives holds billions of records. And in video now, electronic records seems to be the biggest thing. But as an example, or one of the elements is the presidential libraries. We could be up here for hours just talking about each of the individual presidential libraries and how to get access to those records. The best way to help you do research in this area is to actually go to the individual web pages. There's a lot of information. Every one of the libraries posts something online. Some of them are very in-depth, and they describe their holdings that they have. And a lot of them are actually trying to, each of the libraries is posting records online, usually on a monthly basis. So I would really recommend that you go to the website. As you can see, it's archives.gov and locations. Then go under for presidential libraries. If you're interested in the vice presidential records, though, the other aspect is the presidential material staff, which is located here in the DC area. They handle any of the access requests for those records. Those are the people that you would go to get accurate and in-depth information.
So what if you're interested in the executive branch agencies? How will you know? Well, as I mentioned before, the best way to know is to go to the National Archives catalog. So this is just an example of one of our entries in the National Archives catalog. If you go down where it says access restrictions, in this case it is restricted fully, and then we tell you why it's restricted fully, because you have the right to know. So in this case there's national security information, there's also personal privacy, there's law enforcement information. And so if you were to request this document or this record under the Freedom of Information Act, that's what my team would be doing. They would be looking at these, they would be looking for these kind of sensitivities and making a determination on whether they can be made available or not. So what do the different categories mean? Restricted fully means exactly what it sounds like. It means that if you were to show up in our research room, we could not serve it to you that day. You would need to file a Freedom of Information Act for that request. Restricted possibly, since we bring in so much volume of records, we might, in an annual move of things that are coming from the Record Center to the National Archives, have thousands of cubic feet coming in. Sometimes we think something might be sensitive, but we're not sure. So in those cases, we will flag it as restricted possibly. If you were to come to the National Archives and ask for that, we would do a screening on demand in the hold area, at least in our facility in College Park. In which case, my team actually goes to the hold area outside the research room, we open the boxes and we look through. Fairly often, the records actually are not sensitive, but there was some aspect to the description that made us think they might be. In which case, we will label it as screened and serve it to you in the research room. If, when we open the box, we see there's a problem, then we'll label it as do not pull. We'll change the access status to restricted fully, but we will also provide you with a document that tells you what was restricted, why it was restricted, and gives you some advice as to how to make a FOIA request. So that's what restricted possibly means. If it says restricted partly, that means someone has already conducted a review, and they have determined that the vast majority of it's now open, but they have withdrawn sensitive information. In some cases, they're withdrawing whole pages or even whole folders. In some cases, they've actually done a FOIA review where they've done what we call redacted. They have simply removed the little words, sentences, paragraphs within the document that are sensitive. If it says restricted partly, it can be served to you in the research room, but we want you to know that there has been material removed. If you would like to see the material that was removed, you can then file a FOIA for that. And the one that everyone wants to see is unrestricted. Unrestricted's real easy. All that means is come on in, and we can serve it to you in the research room.
So one of the more intriguing elements that people want to really know, and the National Archives has the records for it, and that is if you're a veteran. I want to know the records that the National Archives have. Well, they're all stored out in St. Louis at the National Personal Record Center. But it's kind of unique because they're stored there, but NARA does not legally own those records. It's not until 62 years from the date of separation of that veteran do those records transfer into our archival possession. They don't move anywhere. They just, it's like, they change legal ownership by just still sitting on a shelf. Even though they're in our holdings and people submit FOIA requests for that, whether it be the news media because they're intrigued about, oh, I don't know, someone who's in the news who's done something. Let's just leave it at that. Yeah, whether it's a presidential candidate or it's someone who just went nuts and shot a bunch of people, you can submit FOIA requests to NPRC. They are not doing it under the auspice or the authority of the National Archives. They're doing it under the authority of the individual service branch who owns those records. And so because of that, it's a little confusing. 62 years after someone has separated from the military and they become archival records, historical records, I said it's completely NARA's. And at that point, people have asked for those records too. But 62 years afterwards, there isn't as much, as Martha's already alluded to, there seems to be a release, an additional release because time has passed. When you contemplate and think about the average veteran, if he stepped out of the military at the age of 18, 62 years later, he's getting up there in age. And that's not the majority of our records. Most of them are men and women who stayed in the service a lot longer than that, and a lot of the privacy considerations and issues have passed. Having said that, again, our webpage, the NPRC webpage, is the best place to find out that information. There are a number of ways and vehicles in which to request that information. They have the EVET requirement or access. You can also shoot, if necessary, you could even shoot a FOIA request to foia@nara.gov. That goes directly to my office, and we will make sure that the appropriate people in the National Personal Record Center receive your request.
All right. So how about Congress and the courts? Well, Congress exempted themselves from the Freedom of Information Act. So the records that we have here are actually still owned by Congress, but they are maintained by the National Archives, and they are the records of the committees of Congress. Although the Freedom of Information Act does not apply to those records, they have their own access rules. It's a House rule and a Senate resolution which control access to their files. And in addition, for records that could be opened but may still have sensitive information, we have staff in our Center for Legislative Archives who also conduct review under NARA's general restrictions within those materials. So even though they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, if they have gotten to the point where the House rule and the Senate resolution say that they could be released, we will conduct a review that will be very similar to the type of review you would have under the Freedom of Information Act. We're still going to be looking to protect people's personal privacy, potentially any law enforcement records. Probably privacy would be the biggest interest we would have. And so we have staff there who are trained, to be honest, pretty much in FOIA review. It's a different legal vehicle, but the review is very similar. Court records are a lot easier. To access court records, generally they're open. These are public court transcripts that we have, unless they are sealed by the court or they are grand jury court records. They are open to the public. Our court records tend to be in the field. We have field facilities, as you may know, all across the country. And so certain districts are assigned to certain fields. So we have Chicago and Boston and Fort Worth and San Bruno, and I'm not going to mention them all. I'm sure I'll miss some. And that's generally where people go to gain access to the court records. If you wanted to see something that had been sealed by the court or a grand jury record, the Freedom of Information Act is not going to help you. You would have to petition the court who sealed it or the court under which the grand jury was convened in order to gain access to those materials. But otherwise, they're open and available.
All right, so you've gone through all the process, you've done the research for whatever facility at the National Archives, and you say, nope, I'm going to submit a FOIA request. How do I do that? Well, we have an example here of it's a real FOIA request. The names have been changed. There really is no one by the name of FOIA Son. And what we like is we want as much detail as possible. If you come in and you submit under FOIA a request for all the records from World War II, you are going to get a little response letter or an email back from an employee at the National Archives informing you that's too broad of a topic. Could you please narrow your request? And they'll try and be very helpful. What exactly are you looking for? What are you interested in? In this situation, clearly it's war diaries during 45 of Destroyer Escort 447. That actually is very detailed. And that would go into a system. In this case, I would imagine it's probably Martha's shop. She would log it in. You would receive a number, an account number that it's your case number, that all correspondence is going to be marked that way. That it's very helpful as far as how all that is in order for us to be able to track your request and for you to be able to track your request. Having said that, we also need to have an address. In today's electronic world, though, emails are starting to become easy enough for us to handle. In the past, we had to ask for a postal record, a postal address, even a P.O. box, something that we could send the paper records to. But nowadays, we are scanning, and there's a lot of material that is going up online, and or we can send it to you as a PDF file, or there seems to be a little bit. But in that case, we need an email address. We need some means in which to communicate with you. I have lost myself here.
No. So I guess this is just to show you. She cites under the FOIA, she wants this, and that's something you need to let us know. Because as we said earlier, the vast majority of our records are open and available. You don't have to file a FOIA for our open records. In fact, it's to your advantage not to, because there's an additional administrative burden. Things have to get logged in. It actually makes your response come slower if you file a FOIA for our open records. But if you know that the records you're interested in are not open here at the archives, in your correspondence to us, whether it's a letter, a fax, or an email, you need to say that you're requesting it under the FOIA. Also, as Joe said, we have your email address. Postal address, I will tell you, for some very large FOIAs, it can take years to get them completely done. And people's email addresses tend to change more than their postal addresses. So just so that we can be sure we can keep in touch with you, it is always helpful to have both. And again, very detailed description of what it is that you like.
Right. So if you're going to do it electronically, there are a number of routes in which to send it to the National Archives. If you don't have a clue where in the National Archives where you'd like to submit your FOIA request, you may send it to FOIA@NARA.gov. You may even submit it through a new web portal that the Office of General Counsel is a member of, and that's FOIA Online. It's easy enough to, we don't have the URL up here, but if you typed in FOIA Online and you Googled it, it would hit. It's very quick. There's an organization of a number of federal agencies that are using that portal. It walks you through the process of exactly how much information it won't let you submit anything without all the proper information. If you don't want to do that, like I said before, you may always email FOIA@NARA.gov. Having said that, anytime you submit a request to only one of those two areas and it has nothing to do with the operational records of NARA, it will take longer because it'll take the staff that is in the Office of General Counsel to process, review the record that you're looking for, and send it out to the appropriate office. That invariably takes time. So if you know that you are interested in your military record, again, I would recommend that you go to the National Personnel Records Center. If you're interested in the executive branch records that this agency holds in the DC area, shoot an email to specialaccess_FOIA@NARA.gov. That would be where Martha's team handles it. If, on the other hand, you know for a fact that it's going to be one of our field archives, I would highly recommend that you submit your requests based on our webpage. It'd be a very large webpage shot here. That's why we don't have it here. We just recommend that you go to our webpage to look it up. And any of the presidential records from Ronald Reagan on up to today are subject to FOIA. Anything prior to that, I would recommend that you go talk to the Nixon Library to find out how they have their access, the process by which they work their release of records, and any of the ones prior to Nixon, because each one of those is slightly different and unique.
So, you go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you could say it.
What then?
So you submitted it, and you receive a response from one of our offices saying, we have received your request, here is your case number. The statute gives us 20 working days in which to respond to you. Having said that, as Martha has alluded to, some people have asked for files that are in excess of, I don't know, let's say 35,000 pages. We are not going to, we just physically do not have the staffing, nor do we physically have the capability of reviewing that kind of volume of material. Or the other one is if you have submitted a FOIA request for material that still contains national security information, classified, the secrets of the federal government. The National Archives can't declassify that under our own authority. We actually have to send it out to any agency that has what we call equity in those documents. That can take a while. But we do inform you of all of your rights. It's always in a letter that we, either a letter or an email, in how we communicate to you of the legal rights that you have under the FOIA, and we would like to be able to work with you in order for you to find out for you to finally get the information that you are seeking. After you have heard from us and we have records, the question of fees always comes up. Fees under the FOIA are a very unique and cantankerous subject, I guess is the best way to put it. The National Archives, though, for our historical records, we have a statute. And that statute says we can charge 80 cents a page. In fact, we have to. There are no fee waivers under the FOIA that you would normally see. Like for my operational records, I can release documents to you free of charge. But Martha's unit can't do that. And that's because of that statute. And that statute is because these records are of such a historical significance that the moment one of her staff touches it, there's actually a level in which we might be causing damage to a record, so they have to photocopy it gently. And it's not just Martha, it's the presidential libraries. And clearly, we want to have these records here for the rest of, I don't want to say eternity, but at least the history of our republic, right?
However,
yes.
If you were to file a Freedom of Information Act with a federal agency other than the National Archives for their current records, you would likely be charged search fees in order to locate the records that are responsive. At the National Archives, we don't charge search fees. So even though you will have to pay for reproductions, you will not have to pay for us to search, find the records that are responsive, do the review. And if you're in the DC area or you have a friend or wherever it is that you filed this Freedom of Information Act, if you're willing to go to that facility, you can see it for free. So we often have folks who are disappointed that they cannot get a fee waiver for the reproductions, but we do remind them they would likely be paying as much or more if these records had still been in the custody of the federal agency prior to transfer. So that's all we've got for today. What we did not get into are the specific reasons why things need to be held. We sort of referenced personal privacy and the like, but if anyone has any questions regarding that, we'd be happy to discuss it. Or if anyone has any questions just about the administration of the FOIA, we're happy to talk about that too.
Thank you so much, Martha and Joe. For those of you who are with us on site, we will take your questions, but we ask that you use the microphones in the aisles so that we can capture your voice as we're video recording. So there's any questions. At this time, I'll say that I'm looking online, and we can take your questions if you'd like to use the chat feature. At this time, I don't have any questions online either. And I know how these things work out. Typically, people want to mull it over for a moment, and then they come and have a question for us. So we'll give everybody a minute. It looks like we do have a question from our on-site audience.
Hi, I just was wondering, what's the volume of records you take in, and how do you handle the electronic versus the video versus the paper?
Great question.
And particularly what's going to happen on January 20th, 2017.
Okay, so we have an expert in the audience who can address the transition. I will tell you, for executive branch agency records, we are bringing in several thousand cubic feet a year. I don't work in our accessioning staff, but that's my sense.
It's tens of thousands is what I understand.
And that's the paper.
Right.
We have units within the National Archives who deal specifically with motion pictures, sound recordings, cartographic records, and still pictures, and a whole unit that deals with just electronic records. Electronic records is a challenge because remember, these agencies are creating records with current technology, current software, and we need a way to maintain it and have it accessible till the end of time. And it is a challenge for us, but we have a whole organization who works just with those. John Laster with our Presidential Archives staff. You would give me your title.
Yeah,
John.
Director of the Presidential Materials Division. So I'll address your question as far as January 20th, 2017. So on the federal side, records are going to come in generally much later, as Martha and Joe alluded to. With the Presidential Records Act, immediately at the end of an administration, they transfer into NARA's legal custody. So we get the records much sooner. The positive about it is that the volume of what's created within the White House is not nearly the volume of what's created on the federal side that's going to come in. But you do have, say, for the past administration, George W. Bush, the last administration we came in, about 60 million textual pages and about 180 million emails plus 60 other electronic systems worth of records. So it's certainly not a small volume of material, certainly on the electronic side that'll be coming in, and you know, we don't know exactly the full scope of what will be coming in at Obama in January 20th of 2017, but we know the trend is less paper, more electronic records, but the White House is still very paper-driven to a certain extent, so we do still get a significant amount of paper coming in, and as they alluded to, we'll work for the first 5 years. Those records are not subject to request under FOIA. We work to gain as much intellectual control as we can during that period, so we're better able to find the records that people want when FOIA kicks in. I mean, we do some proactive processing to make records available, but really what we're trying to do is establish as much intellectual control as possible so at that 5-year mark we can begin to respond. And to give you an idea, we received at the 5-year mark for George W. Bush within the first week about 250 FOIA requests. So they come in, there's a significant number. Again, it pales to the federal side, but it is significant for us, the amount of material comes in.
And because those records come in much earlier and much younger, there are more sensitivities. So the FOIA is more significant per, percentage-wise, more of an issue for the presidential records than it is for the executive branch records, which generally come in 15 to 30 years after they're created.
Thank you. While we're seeing if there's any more questions, I see that you've put a slide up about Sunshine Week. Can you tell us a little bit about the slide that is showing celebrating 50 years of freedom of information?
Yes, actually, another component of the National Archives, the Office of Government Information Services, OGIS was their title, is is in cooperation with a number of open government organizations, desires to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act. It will be here in this facility. As you can see, it'll be from 1 to 4:30. Lots of opportunities. You'll actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think they're actually going to have the original act on display. They did that a few years ago too. It's really kind of neat, you know. At least I'm a bit of a FOIA geek, and so I found it neat. Anyway.
So it's going to be Monday, March 14th. So we just wanted to put a plug in. It's a wonderful opportunity for those of us who are interested in this kind of thing. Press certainly uses the FOIA a lot, as do every citizen in the country for very different reasons. I mean, we have veterans who are using the FOIA to get the information they need to get their benefits. We have people doing genealogical research. We have people who are doing historical research into lots of different issues. And then, of course, the press is interested in anything that, you know, relates to anybody who's still in office in some way, shape, or form. So we have a Clinton library. I'm sure they're getting lots of requests right now, as Mrs. Clinton is now running for president. So we feel like we've got old records here, but a lot of what we have has current significance to people. And so, so we just thought this was the appropriate place to be to have this, this celebration. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. This concludes today's Know Your Records program. Thank you for attending, and the presentation video recording and slides will remain available on this YouTube webpage. If you came in late, you can watch it later. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No red light. That's a good sign. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for attending.
John, thank you.
Oh, no problem.
Yes, thanks for jumping in.